Good evening, everyone. My name is Kamalini Ramdas, and I'm faculty advisor for NUS Arts Festival, brought to you by the Center for the Arts. This year, our festival theme is A Question of Time. It is indeed fitting, given the current experiences we have about time and space during the pandemic. Thank you for making time for critical conversations. The use of time in my speech will tell us exactly how much time matters to all of us, right? So you can start counting how many times I say time or temporality. This session is session number 2 out of 3 critical conversations. We had one last week. And today, my 2 guests, right, are Debbie Ding and John Solomon. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute, but they've been invited to chat about time and temporality and hopefully set the tone and sort of get us ready for festival season, right? So Critical Conversations marks the start of festival season here on campus. And so we're hoping that the discussions we have here will make you curious and inspire you to visit the festival website and find out more about the festival and maybe join us for some of the sessions online this year. The topic for today is Reframing the Past, and our 2 guests, as I mentioned, Debbie and John, right? Debbie is a visual artist and technologist, and John is assistant professor at the Department of History, right? They'll be talking to us on the topic of reframing the past. So a little bit about Debbie. She's a prolific artist, but her more recent and notable group exhibitions include President's Young Talent Singapore Art Museum 2018, After the Fall National Museum of Singapore 2017, Singapore Biennale 2016, and Radio Malaya NUS Museum 2016. So for those of you who are on campus, you would have seen Debbie's work at Radio Malaya, right, where there is an exhibition, a part of the exhibition where her work is on Pulau Saigon, and I think she'll be talking about that. And maybe John will also share a little bit about his experiences taking students on field trip to the museum to talk about that piece. John teaches history at the Department of History here at NUS. He teaches many modules, right, on popular culture, Asian history, and historiography. His research interests include social history, the British Empire, and decolonization. He has published a recent book on untouchability and South Asian migration in colonial Singapore, and this is published by New York Routledge in 2016. So John and Debbie were invited to think about what it means to reframe the past through their respective approaches to the archive. Focusing on methodology, both of them will articulate their approaches to historicizing through the processes of cataloging, collecting, mapping, and focusing on social histories. So I'm really excited because it's not often that you get an artist and a historian talking about cataloging, historicizing, and the archives, right? So they seem like 2 unlikely partners, but as you will hear from their talk, right, there are a lot of overlaps and of course points of departure. And I'll be asking them to chat a little bit about that. So Debbie and John will each speak for about 10 minutes, and this will be followed by some questions from me, and also later on from you in the audience and those of you joining us online. So for those of you online, you'll be able to type in your question in the Q&A box and we'll be alerted to them and I'll read them out for our guests on the panel. So I'd like to invite John to start us off and then we'll have Debbie right after him. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kamal. I'd also like to thank Marianne and Kamal for inviting me for this conversation. And thank you all for joining us here today. I think this is the first time I've actually spoken in front of a live audience in over a year. So, I appreciate the opportunity. So I was told to talk about the theme of time and the archive. And speaking of time, I was told to stick to a strict 10-minute limit or below if I could. So instead of giving you a research presentation, I'm just going to briefly talk about some reflections I've had and some themes that come up in my work as a historian, and then leave some space for conversation afterwards. So as a social historian, someone who's interested in the history of the histories of everyday people, I find myself thinking about periodization and the archive quite a bit. So what is periodization? One way of looking at it, it's the process of applying time frames in history, dividing history into segments, dividing periods of time into conceptual categories. For those of you who've studied history before, you would be familiar with the time periods that we tend to deploy to make sense of the long passage of time. We have periods like the ancient age, the classical period, the Middle Ages, the modern age, things like that. These broad conceptual categories. So why do historians deploy these categories, and why do we bother labeling and categorizing chunks of time? So amongst other reasons, understanding what defines a specific era and how it differs from what came before, what came after, helps us to understand the nature of societal change. It helps us to understand how people and societies change over time. Not just change, but how they remain the same as well. So it helps us to understand continuities and discontinuities. And in doing so, it helps us to understand and frame the present. So this is an image of different periods of Singapore's history. It's taken from the National Library Board website, and this is one way you could periodize, for example, Singapore's history. And in the past, a lot of teaching, a lot of museological practice focused on a 200-year timeline for Singapore. But nowadays, we look at a 700-year timeline, and that has a lot of different implications for how we understand Singapore's history. So a couple of observations about periodization. The lines between different periods can be quite blurry, right? There aren't hard boundaries. And there are many different ways to periodize history. We could think about environmental factors. We could think about time in terms of geological time, deep the processes, natural processes. We could think about Singapore's history in terms of social factors like migration, or as is often done, you can think of Singapore's history in terms of political factors, who held power and when and why. And this high politics approach to periodization is very common, and it tends to be the manner in which nation states write and remember their own histories. But as a social historian, I found that when you interview ordinary people about their everyday lives, when you think about their own life narratives, when they think about their own life narratives, the important milestones of their lives, these don't always conform to these grand periodizations of national history or big history. So I've been thinking about how we can conceptualize historical change while making space for different ways about thinking about time. So I'm currently researching a social history of citizenship. So how ordinary people made sense of all these new borders and passports and nationality regimes that were coming up during decolonization. It was a time when forms of dual nationality were gradually phased out. So people who had transnational lives before, who may have had relationships with multiple governments in multiple places, had to slowly make decisions about where they were going to be. And it's interesting how this period panned out in the context of individual lives in quite prolonged, protracted, and messy ways that don't fit into the neat timelines of political history. So there are lots of oral history accounts that I'm going through, and some of them might seem quite banal and everything, but they reveal how different individuals had such different kinds of thought processes involved in thinking about their futures, how they envisioned their mobilities, how they envisioned concepts like citizenship and nationality at the time. So another thing about periodization is that the kind of periodization, different kinds of periodization lend themselves to different lessons, different narratives, and different stories, and different identities as well. So for example, I found it quite interesting how we periodize migration when we think about Singapore's history. Because obviously migration is a big part of Singapore's history, but we tend to focus on colonial era migration. If you go to the museums, you think about a migration in educational textbooks. We focus on migration in the colonial period that is seen as a sort of foundational migration that establishes Singapore as a modern society. But migration after independence, it's rarely covered in quite the same way. So it's migration from the 70s and 80s and 90s it's considered part of a long present rather than being historicized. So what does that kind of conceptual framing mean for national identities, our understandings of inclusion? So it's a question I've been pondering. How can social history disrupt, alter, or make us have a sort of dialogue with the way that we think about periodization? So very quickly, the next thing I want to talk about is the archive. Okay, historians obviously need to consult with primary sources, historical evidence to research and write history. And a lot of this, for a lot of historians, comes from archives, the national archives, institutional archives, libraries, private collections. All of these institutions serve as repositories for historical documents. And these sorts of archives obviously make the writing of history possible for researchers. The problem with many archives is that they reflect the asymmetries of power that existed in the past. So, for example, a common type of archival record is a government record. And government records are written from the perspective of governments of the day. In the colonial period, especially, this meant that most records were written from the perspective and for the benefit of white male elites, for example. So who is excluded from the archives? Many people, the losers of conflicts, the marginalized, the illiterate, women, children, minorities, the working class. So large sections of groups and individuals are excluded from the archive. That's not to say that these groups are not present in written records of the past, but when they are, they tend to be spoken for. Their lives and experiences are not presented from their own perspectives, but are instead quite fragmentary. So how can we overcome these sorts of gaps, these sorts of biases in the archive, or these silences in the archives when we write histories? Is it possible to write histories of unarchived processes and in groups? Are there alternative kinds of archives? So these are some of the questions I asked myself when I researched untouchable migrants in Singapore's past. So as some of you know, untouchables are at the bottom of India's caste system. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, many untouchable migrants came to Singapore and comprised a sizable section of Indian labor migrants here. But they were not reflected in archival records because their class identities, their occupational identities superseded their caste identities. So I knew that they existed as a group, and I wanted to find out what their conditions were, what their experience of prejudice was, because they did receive prejudice even in Singapore and Malaya when they came over. So how do you recover a history of prejudice when it's not recorded in the archive? So that's something that I had to work through whilst trying to do my research. And going beyond the issue of trying to recover these sorts of histories, these unarchived histories, I've also thought about how I'm doing so, how these sorts of social histories can shift our understanding of a period. So, some of the things I've thought about in my research, and I'd love to hear what you think and if you have any questions later on. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Debbie, you're up next.
Thank you so much for having me as well to share about the work. It's really interesting to hearing from John talking about, starting his talk, talking about periodization and time frames. I also want to start with a kind of framing for information, a very humble one, the grocery list. This is actually from a work of fiction from American author Walter Miller, who wrote this post-apocalyptic novel called A Canticle for Leibowitz. And it's from the first half of the novel is written from perspective of a young brother Francis, who is we soon discover is actually a monk from a dark ages where some social technological regression has occurred in society in reaction to some offensive technologies and technological weapons. So when I first read the book, you read it, you thought it's a fantasy novel, but it turns out that it's that this brother Francis is trying to preserve this archives of all these information, fragments of circuit diagrams and grocery lists that he finds, that he is copying out in gold and he's gilding them, and then it's treated like a religious text, but he doesn't understand what it is. But of course, what fascinates me about the grocery list is that it's very real. For us, we understand, and it suddenly makes almost when we see it, it makes a life, real and believable. We can think that's what they were eating. That they definitely lived. And there's also this other list, which is actually an extract from Jennifer Barry's items that were found on the island of Pulau Saigon, which was a list that really sparked my curiosity about the former island in the Singapore River, which I realized was not very well known in Singapore and had sort of vanished off the maps in about 1975. Also not really known to Singaporeans, despite having quite a sizable, quite a lot of things on it, an abattoir, railway stations, and I was intrigued at how a geographical feature sort of disappears. Um, I first encountered the story because I was making works about the Singapore River, and I was trying to make a collection, a kind of archive of stories. And so I invited people to give me their stories about the Singapore River, whether they were real or not real. One of the stories I got was about Pulau Saigon. So in the beginning, I didn't even know whether it was a real story or not a real story. But I perceived that there was a big hole in this gap in what we know about Pulau Saigon. And I guess as an artist, I wanted to try to help fill it in. And thinking about lists, I read a book a few years ago about how to do research. And it said, the book had said in the very beginning, finding some early modern English laundry list would not suffice on its own to write a PhD thesis. This is literally what they wrote. And I'm like, okay, I'm not writing a thesis here, but I am spending several years on a project that began with a list, a list a bit like that, very simple as that. And there's often sometimes this feeling that are these micro fragments good enough as a starting point for research, or maybe are these small domestic histories worth researching? Does it have to be something really epic, where you can find lots of information on before it's worth looking into? And I know at first glance, a mundane laundry list doesn't, seems to appear to lack any depth of meaning. But, when activated by human eyes, I think that the list still offers a rich opportunity for a range of readings, which can be used as a starting point for artistic speculations, on the histories and the geographies of different places. So I think also it also reflects the kind of maybe unseen or undervalued labor, and could be used also to raise questions about some of the connections we have between art, history, and also everyday life through the ages. And this is actually a picture of the futures cone. It's thinking of that connection, what exactly binds us to history. We're all on this one same continuum. And this is a futures cone that is often used by designers and futurists to explain our framing when we talk about making a speculative work, like trying to see into the future, what things are going to be like, designing for the future. So it shows, the utility of this cone is what you see in it is that there are different kinds of futures. There is the probable future. There is also the preferred future, and there's also preposterous futures, ones that are not very likely. And of course, one could say when you look at this, the questions that come out can be quite different. You could say, what is projected to happen in the next 5 years? Or you could say, what ought to happen in the next 5 years? Or what preposterously impossible thing could occur? So these kind of, thinking this way, you can see how these are many different kinds of possible futures. So our projected cone, of where we're on a line. We're not on a infinite possibilities. I mean, it is infinite, but then we still have a chance to almost steer this ourselves in which part of the cone we want to go into. And I think just as the cone extends forward like a lens, it also extends back when we look back into time, So just as our future vision is kind of limited by our imagination, I think also the possible histories or possible readings of the histories are also only limited by our imagination and of course the physical evidence that we can find for it. For me, it makes clear that the only thing we're really absolutely clear of is the present, and that all the historical events are going to be in some way interpretations, and whether they are consigned to history, whether someone writes them down properly is almost a separate thing to the occurring of the thing, of the history. And there are so many possible distortions that can occur because of our current moment, all the things that happen. And so, I sometimes feel a bit less anxious thinking about all the big gaps in evidence, because I think there's always room for this interpretation of the universe or timeline that we live in. So, what exactly is this timeline? What universe are we in? And what for me it was asking this question of what is the story of Pulau Saigon. The problem is that we can't really go back in time sometimes to find out about, like, say, the site of Pulau Saigon. There was not very much to speak to. I mean, it's almost like the people in the past are like, jokes on you. We didn't write it down, so the people in the future don't know what it is actually. All we have are the kind of fragments that we have to piece together the story, and I think the museum and the art gallery are a bit similar in that they have that transformative power to take all these fragments and the labels we write for them and all the broken up bits, and then from that we can produce a whole coherent representational universe that that we understand as this timeline, that the timeline of the past. And on its own as well, it would not be able to represent everything, like if you see that red fragment, the tiny red fragment on the screen, it's not going to be able to represent a whole bowl. But of course, it wouldn't be able to represent Pulau Saigon, but the museum sustains that fiction for us. So I think that, thinking about it that way, thinking of using the museum, or the art gallery, presenting in that form is an opportunity to allow kind of new circuits of meaning to emerge, based on how we present it as a set, a collection, or a gallery, or a library of things, a show. These signifiers are alive even if the objects are incomplete objects. They're traveling around, in the space of that plausibility cone, connecting with ideas in ways that might have been previously thought unthinkable. Yeah. So, yes, sorry. So this is actually the list of items again, the words, of the items from Pulau Saigon. So when I first saw them, they were in a small cabinet in Art Science Museum, and I was showing a work about Singapore River next to it. And I think what I was struck by is that there was this big shiny Titanic show next to it, and the items I saw were just really small and I want to say quite underwhelming. They were also, there weren't the story next to it. It wasn't like, they were very humble objects. But I was really interested in them. I really wanted to bring them back to life. But there were so few facts for me to grasp on, visiting the archaeology department here. So to look at the real things themselves, they were very small. They were significantly tinier and more degraded than I imagined. So rather than to kind of write a story or to try to fill it in with text where there were few facts for me to use, and rather than overselling my ability to imagine all these things, I decided to try to create a unforgetting machine. Not really remembering it. I can't say it's remembering it, but it's only trying to unforget it a bit. So I wanted to bring the objects from another timeline into this timeline. Creating the most likely object based on our current understanding of what things are, based on the labels that have been assigned to the objects on the list. So deep learning models are available to us in the form of things like, Google Images. You don't know what a thing looks like, you go and Google the image it, and then you see, even if you don't know a concept, you just Google the concept and see what image comes back. And then you say, oh, okay, I get an idea now. It's been translated into this image for me, and I'm going to try to imbibe all that, understanding of it. So for example, taking all these images of asbestos, trying to translate it, into a 3D object. So from all those photographs to try to make the sort of palimpsest of all the images, and then making a machine process to produce an object and then taking it into the real world, printing it out. So producing, bringing that object from another timeline into this timeline. So it's not a library of text, but more a library of speculative objects that you can hold. They're all designed to be hand-sized. They're not. They're all meant to be something that you can interact with. Well, reasonably, yes. So you can actually touch them gently. Yeah, you can actually relate to them, see that they're right in front of you. And I think there are also other factors that kind of affect our kind of interpretation of an object. You know, there's also the scale. I mean, the scale is like one of the things. Because I was using images as the reference, I couldn't really tell the scale. So I made all the objects hand size. Yeah, so about 7.5 to 8 cm, 8.5 cm. And it's funny that we often relate to things so differently also when they are in a different scale. You know, so a large, so for example, if there were coins that were the size of your hand, um, and this besides scale, there's also time. Time is also another factor that affects our vocabulary, you know, and our understanding of things. You know, such terms. You know, for example, today maybe today a handphone looks like a certain thing, you know, but in the past, you know, handphones were pretty large bricks as well. So they're not this different. They're not wrong, but they're changing as well. And also as a data set, so I said I've used Google Images, you know, all these kind of big sets of images like ImageNet. These are also not without their bias. Who writes them? Who puts them together? And who cleans up the data? Although it's supposed to be a collection of all human knowledge, it's also not, you know, like when the Google they were doing their machine learning algorithm, they were talking about how on their blog they wrote about how there was this problem with trying to train the machine to make an image of a dumbbell, because dumbbells always have all the dumbbell pictures have hands on them holding them. Oh, probably microphones also. So these are the kind of things that are always seen in relation to, you know, us. You know, we it's hard to be neutral when everything is filtered through us. We are always holding the things, you know. So it's hard to be take ourselves out of it. You know, take the bias out of it. Yeah. So another work I just want to very quickly share about, it's also maybe a bit of like self-historicizing. So, you know, thinking also about how, you know, when I was making Pulau Saigon, I think a lot of it was not only the work, but also talking to people about it, telling people about it. And so I want to share a bit about this. It's called The Legend of Debbie. Yes, but it's a map legend. It's a legend. It's not like the other kind of legend. So you know, this is also a speculative work like Pulau Saigon, and also for me, a form of translation. So it's a 3D game, which was recently screened in a state of motion as a gameplay video. So over the last 10 years, I created a lot of data, a lot of collections of images and things. And I wanted, when I revisit the material, I find myself picking out new things all the time. And sometimes the text I write, I realize that the versions have changed so much over the years. They're almost different stories. You know, how I articulate it is also changing. So in this work, I tried to turn the camera myself on this archive of my work over the years. Also, this is a bit like a COVID era work, you know, where you know you stuck at home, only have your own material to look at. So I decided to mine this data a bit more, where trying to turn my works, translating it into a digital space. We often talk of digitization, but I think that's also a process of translating a work from one form to another, and also you know, thinking about how exactly I could make each of these works into kind of wormholes into a kind of interpretive universe, 3D space that could be explored in a non-linear fashion. So this is these are some of the my sort of my take on how I'm trying to think about how I how even historicize or how I even archive my own work, since so much of my work has been about archives as well. Yeah, so this is a work that I'm producing a second version of for June this year. Yeah, so I think this is what I wanted to share about laundry list and my alternative timelines. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Debbie. Thank you so much. Okay, so I think that's a really interesting approach from two different disciplinary sort of backgrounds and training. So it's now my turn to ask some questions and hopefully generate some thinking. I mentioned earlier that I'd like for each of you to reflect a little bit on each other's presentations and say a little bit about the connections and points of departure between your work, right? So at some level, Debbie, I see you both as time travelers in some sense, right? You're trying to make sense of something, right? But you have very different tools and magic at your disposal, what you can use, right, to time travel, right? So I'd like to maybe have each of you reflect on each other's tools and magic, right? So what is it that Debbie gets to do that you don't get to do, John? And what is it that John has to do that maybe Debbie, you wish you might be able to do, or you think that it's actually tougher being John and easier being you in this time travel when you do the time traveling? So maybe, you know, some reflections on Debbie's plausibility clone as a cone as a historian, or even Debbie thinking about what an unforgetting machine for untouchability might look like. All right, yeah. So maybe we'll have John start us off first.
Okay, sure. A lot of what Debbie was talking about spoke to my the things that I think about when I'm doing my work as well. I think there's a lot of overlaps in the questions that we're asking and the way that we're dealing with fragments. One thing that stood out was when you were talking about having all these fragments and trying to create a coherent whole. So and how I think you decided not to do that with Pulau Saigon. You were embracing how all of these things were fragmentary, and you use that to talk about possibilities and so on. So I guess that's possibly one point of departure in terms of, for historians, we have to somehow take the fragments and create some kind of overarching narrative about that. And it's not always easy. Sometimes you just have to accept that things are fragmentary and write that into your sort of analysis, I think. I love the plausibility cone. Where can I get one? I, th I think we also think about, historians don't really think about the future all that much. I mean, we do, but that's not part of what we do. We're not speculating about the future, or that's for futurists and so on. But we do think about how the past relates to the present, and we see that as a dynamic, shifting relationship all the time. The past can change the present, and the present can change the past. In that sense, we do think about counterfactuals, which I think made me think about the plausibility cone. We think about the paths not taken, the what might have beens, why certain things turned out the way they did. And we engage in that kind of productive counterfactuality because it helps us to understand the present a little bit more. But I think if that was a plausibility cone, the diameter and circumference would be much smaller because we can't engage in too much speculation. It's so I appreciate. I think it's really interesting when you have a broader range of potentials, and it makes you think about the past and history in a very different way.
Thanks, John. Debbie, what do you think?
It's I guess I actually think, you know, in history I'm quite jealous of what you all do as well, because in a way sometimes as an artist, when I approach doing this kind of artistic research, I'm often worried, am I doing it the right way? Is it rigorous enough? Am I interviewing even right? Am I missing out a big hole of thing because I approach it as an artist, not as an academic? So I mean, I want to say I'm an amateur, so enthusiast, you know, kind of level, trying to approach sometimes historical topics. You know, I approach when I met the archaeologist Jennifer Barry, who was the one who had actually written the catalogue and had documented everything. I also asked her. She put a lot of question marks everywhere in the document. I said, so she couldn't. I was asking her what it looked like, and she's like, I can't remember. And I said, could you speculate on what it looks like? She said, I don't think that's actually what her, you know, as an archaeologist, she's supposed to speculate and imagine what shape the thing was. So that's for me the reason why in the end I've ended up making art, because I think there's still a room for that interpretation for me as an artist, where I'm allowed to kind of take that speculative vein further. Also, I think you're right. Also, I think I tried to I had a background also as a writer first, because my degree was in literature. So I thought I was going to do writing. In fact, I was going to make Pulau Saigon a writing project at first, and somehow it became a physical object in the end. But I wanted to kind of shift the work also to the audience, you know, to make them be the ones thinking about, you know, what it means to have all these fragments presented to you, rather than I have presented them a fairly complete a thing. They would have to chew through this a bit more. That's kind of my take on it. Trying to also get people to actually piece it together. And I think also in these kind of mediums of work, showing it in maybe a bit unconventional, like whole lot of 53 prints, or in my other works, I tried to use pulse laser holography, where if you stand at a different place, you see a different part of the image. So all these kind of things were just ways of also forcing people to realize that there isn't one exact view anymore, that there are so many other readings of it.
So I think my understanding is that to to a large extent, the two of you are interested in, as a social historian and as a visual artist, you're interested in rewriting, right, histories, and rewriting in a way that is maybe more, makes us pay attention to silences, right, and what's not being said, right? But as you mentioned, Debbie, sometimes there's a lot of doubt about, am I listening too intently? Am I hearing murmurs where actually there's no sound at all? And you said that this is something you struggle with as a non-academic, right? That second guessing yourself. I think a lot of academics do that too, right? As in, like, when you go into the archives and you think, like, there's a story here, but I'm not sure what it is, right? So I wonder if you can each sort of reflect on what makes you pay attention to something and not something else, right? And what do you struggle with when when you're second guessing? What are some ways that you actually try to work around the reading of silence, right? How do you make sense of it? Maybe Debbie, you want to start us off for this one?
Um, yes, so there was another, maybe I talk about it in relation to another project I had done, which was also because it seems weird. So now that today, substation announced that it was closing for good, and 5 years ago I had the chance to work on their archive exhibition, and they had it was a massive pile of paper. It was completely unsorted. It was hard to distinguish which. It was a big mess, and there was a lot of gaps. So there were like lots of things, and then empty for like 4 years. Yeah. So it was a very problematic archive to work with. For me, I stopped having. I stopped. I actually ended up having to stop using time because of this silence. I couldn't put it by time anymore. So instead, I tried to organize by different, almost like framing, except I use space as a way to organize the things, the physical space, the physical building, as a way to organize all that I knew about it, and to not have to think on it on the line, but that it could go in all directions, almost like a mind map. Yeah.
I'm excited about that as a geographer, right? Because that would be my way of framing anything would be space. So John, what do you think about that? Space over time, time over space?
Space over time.
Do you think that using space to fill to understand silence is a good way? How do you understand the silence or make sense of it? So you said that sometimes when we're trying to do this kind of work, we're not really sure whether there's something there, right? Is this something relevant? Is it not, right? So what are some strategies? So do historians use space in the way that Debbie is talking about, filling the missing time with space, or are there some other strategies that you might use?
I haven't used space yet, but it's something I could definitely consider. I think silences, sometimes you can work around silences. It's possible to work around silences. So one example would be when I was researching what happened to forced Asian laborers on the death railway in the Second World War, because we tend to, a lot of the historical work that's been done, it's usually about European POWs, even though Asian laborers, the Romusha, were the majority from this whole region. And I was trying to understand this in the context of trying to understand what happened to untouchable municipal cleaners, because the records just end around the time of the Japanese occupation. And I wanted to find out what happened to them afterwards. So there was a silence there. But you can piece together things. You start to find certain things, like after the war, I found a public works department source that talked about how the workforce was decimated. And so I was wondering what happened to all of them. They obviously died. And then you piece things together, you realize that a lot of these people were forcibly sent to work on the railway and never came back. And so you can find little fragments to work around the silences. And sometimes the silences themselves are productive because they make you ask questions. Why, for example, in social memory, do we not remember Why do we not talk about these groups? Why don't we remember them? Why don't various countries discuss these things? Why are they not part of national history? Why are they not part of social memory? And that silence becomes productive because it opens up whole new lines of questioning, I think.
Thank you so much. I see that we have a question from the online audience. So I'm going to try and read that out. Sorry if I look like I'm squinting, okay, because the screen's back there. Okay, Debbie, this is a question for Debbie. Considering the vast space of speculation that pulling items from another timeline into one's current timeline entails, do you feel a need to provide meaning to viewers? Is it necessary to guide the audience, and are there potential downfalls in mass unguided speculation?
Yes. I think this is almost about how how you play with the audiences willing to suspend their disbelief. Obviously, if there is no frame, like no reality to hold on to, the speculative work doesn't work. That you need to have that contrast almost between what you know it to be. If you didn't know anything about, for example, if you didn't know anything about Singapore and then you went to the Singapore Discovery Center, it wouldn't be as hilarious as it is. You'd be like, I don't understand this, but because you know what Singapore is, you're like, oh, this is different. So when we talk about, I think for like speculative designers and artists, there is a need to maintain that trust with, that you trust me, that how I treated the material as well. So, for example, when I make Pulau Saigon, one trusts that it comes truly from the material that I've told you. In fact, audience wants to believe that there's a grain of reality to it. That this is exactly what it is. This is the truth. This is the truth of what Pulau Saigon is. So that is something that we must be able to agree on. Then when we talk about the possibilities, then it has meaning. So it's about playing with that very that level of, to what degree are you willing to almost to suspend disbelief for a while. Yeah, but not too far. That means, yeah.
Thanks, Debbie. I want to pick up on Pulau Saigon. I know, John, you said that you take your students on a field trip to to our NUS museum, and you actually talk to the students about this particular exhibit, right? So can you say a little bit about how you engage with it, and maybe you'll give Debbie, this whole in a way, like she's getting someone actually to share what happens when other people see her work, right? So could you share a little bit about how you do that?
I mean, the broader context is that I run this module about Singapore history, approaches to Singapore history. So thinking about different ways of understanding Singapore's history. And rather than just have it be about historical scholarship and historiography, I try and include a couple of weeks where we think about approaching history from completely radically different kinds of practitioners' perspectives. So artists or museum curators and so on. So I bring them to the NUS Museum, and Michelle, who's seated in the audience, gives them a very good tour, and we discuss all the different exhibits, including Pulau Saigon. So, and then afterwards in class, I talk to them about some of the things that they've seen. And Pulau Saigon, along with the prep rooms in the NUS Museum, I think, help the students to thinking about history, to use a term, in a more playful way, and in a more speculative way, because the discipline of history is, there are certain rigidities about how we approach it and how we understand how we study history. And I think it's good for them to think about how we might think about Singapore's history in a more speculative way, in a more playful way, I think.
I think so for Debbie, would that be one of the aims of the project, right? When you started off, was for people to understand history in a sort of playful way, right? So making history less serious, or are you looking for some other kind of connection also that you'd like the audience to make when they see your work?
I think what I admired from the people I've spoken to, like I spoke to an amateur archaeologist, Mr. Kolian Huat, who was the one who discovered Pulau Saigon, actually, because his interest in Neolithic wares. He thought he saw it, so he went to look for it and dig it up on his own in the river. So I was really amazed that sometimes we don't have that connection to wanting to find out, believing it's possible to find out, and to almost take that question a bit further, to on your own. Even if I'm not a historian, I'm not in archaeology, I can still ask that question. I can still want to find out more and explore that interest in it, because I think sometimes now people, so even young people today, I think sometimes they're like, am I being graded for this? Then they do it rather than to pursue their interest in different things like that.
There's a question for John, and I'm going to read it out on the screen here. Are you hopeful that surfacing on the ground narratives will make their way out of academia and into popular consciousness? And how can we facilitate this?
I am hopeful. I think across the board, I see much more emphasis in social history across, the heritage industry and the museums in Singapore. I think there's been a much bigger focus on shifting away from, a focus on the standard Singapore story with economics and politics and so on, but looking at the lives of ordinary people. And I think there has been scholars like Kevin Blackburn have talked about this. There's been a democratization of social memory making, and there's a relationship between historical scholarship, social memory making, and of course institutional practice. And I can see how all of that is the power dynamics are changing. So I have a lot of hope for the fact that there are going to be more social histories, and people are more involved in the writing of these histories, not just academia and not just the institutions.
Thank you. So I'm keeping a close watch on time here, and I feel like I have a couple more questions here, but I can't ask them. But I'm going to now turn to the audience here because you've been so patiently sitting here, and ask if you have any questions here, the audience who are with us. If you do, just raise your hands, and I'll get someone to pass you a mic if you have a question for our panelists. Anyone in the room have a question for the panelists? If not, I get to ask my question. So I will. So my last question, all right, I have two, but I think I will do, oh wait, hang on. Time check, 3 more questions. So I have time for 3 more questions? No, I don't have time for 3 more questions. Okay, all right, so I'm gonna ask my question here. So Debbie, in your presentation, you talked about new circuits of meaning, right? I really like this, right? And, and each of you talked about how it is possible to move away from institutional meaning making and the possibility of using art as a way to reframe the past or new kinds of archives. But I want to go back to this notion of the preposterous, right? And the sort of the preposterous or the implausible, right? So, and ask you to maybe speculate, right, a little bit on that. What space is there for these preposterous, the preposterous in the production of new circuits of meaning, right? So at some level, the research that you do and the outputs that the art that you produce, they are a leap of faith in the sense that you don't necessarily have all of it there, right? You're trying to make sense of it as best you can, right? But given this possibility of that there is a leap of faith being made here, how would you be able to push that a little bit? Like, what other kinds of ideas might you want to bring into the discussion that maybe you haven't yet, right? So what scope is there for doing something more preposterous, right, in the production of new circuits of meaning? Maybe Debbie, if you can share a little bit about some new ideas that you're working with that are taking you elsewhere, right? In a way, it's a leap of faith for you as a practitioner, right? Stuff that you're not sure about, but you're kind of working with right now.
Yes. So I'm working on a lot of things in using a game engine, Unity 3D. So building almost like games, but they're not really like normal video games, your normal commercial games. Instead, they are sort of, I'm just using a game engine as a way to tell a narrative in a completely different way, and also rewriting almost the script for them. And I think for me also thinking of almost the tone or the narrative where it comes from, I always have liked the idea of it being almost a bit ridiculous, a bit naive, to take that tone of it, preposterous, because sometimes also if we are presented with everything and everything was like, when I think back to like Singapore Memory Project, for example, a lot of the stories are like very pleasant, nice memories. So, when I wanted to collect stories on my own, I wanted the collection to also include the bad ones, but not just not just the bad not only because people say, oh, my memory is very bad, I don't recall, but also because there were also unhappy things, or even things that were that people would challenge, so having that is much more interesting. And even if even if it's an untruth, it starts that discussion that people will talk about it, rather than it being sailing by and people not actually reflecting on things. Yeah.
John, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Well, I'm all for the preposterous. There's always space for the preposterous, but as a historian, there is limited space for what I'd call productive counterfactuals. So I every new piece of research is sort of a leap of faith, and you're engaging in a lot of initial speculation, but eventually you have to try and sort of connect the dots and present something that is not preposterous in a sense. But but in terms of oral histories, quite often you come up, or sometimes you come up against oral history interviews that are clearly wrong. That's the fallibility of human memory. Someone describes something that couldn't possibly have happened or couldn't possibly be true, and it's preposterous in a way. And I try and use that as well, not because I'm trying to find out an accurate account of what happened in the past, but rather the way that someone has framed their memories and structured their life narratives. I think that's interesting as well. So that's a way I try and incorporate the preposterous in my work, I guess.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So we have a last question. I think it's a really nice question. All right. So this will be the last question for the evening. And it's from the online audience. So I'm going to read it out. Both of you, if your home was excavated, similar to Pulau Saigon, what is an item you would wish to remember you by and why?
I'm going to say something maybe a bit problematic, because I'm going to say am I allowed to say a hard drive of
Sure.
something digital?
Sure.
Because I don't know, maybe not hard drive, that's actually very bad. It's just in the cloud. I'm going to say there's a big cloud folder full of the Debbie things. I don't know. I mean, archives also here have got hard drives sometimes, and the media, the things that are required to access that specific drive. So maybe I mean, a storage device. Because I feel like so much of my work is digital, so much of it is data like that. Where it exists, it's kind of weird to say, if there was nothing left, then it'd be my website really. That my website would be this archive which I've made of myself, of all the things I've worked on, and then that would be the thing I would leave behind, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Debbie. What about you, John?
I don't know. It's a very tough question. I don't think I actually want to be remembered all that much. But if I did something from my house, maybe my cat skeleton or something.
Your cat skeleton. Okay. So thank you very much for both of you for being so candid and for willing to talk about your personal life, your art, your archives, and basically how we might rethink reframing the past, right? So I'm going to say a couple of words now about what to expect next in terms of the next critical conversation. Um, so the next critical conversation we have is with Sarah Tebia Samuel and Sherman Ong, who are both filmmakers, and they're going to be talking to us about how they tell their stories, right? So the critical conversation is on telling our stories, and that's next Wednesday, and it's an online session, so it's not a hybrid session. You guys can join us online, so all of us will be online and chatting. And so we hope to see you there, right? As you can see, we had a really great discussion today, and thank you again to John Solomon and Debbie Ding. Okay, you guys are awesome. All right, I'm so excited about today's panel. So you've set the bar really high for next week. Okay, so do join us next week, and please remember to give us your feedback for today's session. So there's a barcode you can use to give your feedback for today's session. And also do join us for the festival, right? So visit our festival website and check out all the awesome shows we have lined up for you. So if you're interested in time and temporality, do make time for the arts in NUS, all right? So definitely be a part of the Arts Festival, okay? Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening.